All right, we'll restart. It's our last session. Florian Vermeiren, good friend, fellow Spinozist, but also example to us Spinoza fanatics here at KU Leuven, and generally really a natura humana exemplar, a model of human nature, as Spinoza writes in Preface to Ethics 4. And of course, the main organizer, together with Professor Roland Breuer, of this conference. Florian is a postdoctoral research here at the Institute of Philosophy. Not yet officially, I guess. Yeah. As of next week, Florian will be a postdoctoral research here at the Institute of Philosophy. He is the author of a dozen journal articles on Spinoza, Leibniz, Bergson, Whitehead, and Deleuze. And his first book came out this year titled A Geometry of Sufficient Reason, Space and Quantity in the Works of Spinoza, Leibniz, Bergson, Whitehead, and Deleuze with Routledge. Today, Florian will be presenting to us a paper titled The Incompleteness of Durational Existence. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Siebrand. Hello. Thank you, Siebrand. So I hope you have a little bit of energy left for my talk. It has been a long day, I know. So I want to return a bit to the theme that was more the focus yesterday, the Hegelian critique of Spinoza. And I want to zoom in on one particular aspect of it. Now, according to Hegel, one of the consequences of the absence of negativity in Spinoza's metaphysics is that temporality becomes a mere illusion. The idea is simple. For temporal succession and for duration, you need determination, which, according to Hegel, is impossible without some form of negation or negation of negation, which is supposedly absent from Spinoza's ontology. So in other words, when God swallows up all diversity of the world, he also swallows up all temporal diversity in the world. If everything is ultimately God, everything is ultimately eternal. This is Hegel's reading, which is still quite popular. But the question is this eleatic atemporality, is this really Spinoza's fate? I don't think so. I'm still not sure if Spinoza's metaphysics lacks all negativity, but I don't think that the reality of duration depends on this. Instead, I think that the often overlooked notion of incompleteness plays an important role in the ontological status of duration. So maybe incompleteness is Spinoza's alternative to negation or to Hegelian negativity. So incompleteness or partiality. Incompleteness of partiality is a notion that Spinoza uses in two crucial instances to solve two very similar puzzles. The first puzzle is that if all IDs are God's IDs, how can there be inadequate IDs? Well, Spinoza tells us in a corollarium to proposition 11 of the second part, and we will discuss it better later on. He tells us there that all IDs are God's IDs and are thus adequate, but there are parts of these IDs that are incomplete or partial, and these are inadequate. So it is incompleteness which leaves room for inadequacy within the adequate understanding of God, within God's adequate intellect. And the second riddle is, if everything is ultimately God, and God is fully active, how can there be passivity in nature? Well, Spinoza says, God is the complete cause of everything, and thus there is only activity in nature. But there are pieces of these acts of God, and they are in themselves incomplete. And these are passions instead of acts. So it is the notion of incomplete or inadequate cause that makes room within God's causal action for passivity. Now, I will discuss both these puzzles in more detail later, but my claim today is that these puzzles and their answers correspond to a third puzzle, namely, if everything is God and God is eternal, how can there be duration? I'll try to show that the answer must be similar to the previous puzzles. That is that durational existence is an incomplete part of eternal existence. And this might seem like a very perplexing idea at first, but I will try to show step by step how it follows from Spinoza's text. Now, at first sight, Hegel seems to be right that duration is not real for Spinoza. There are many reasons to think that for Spinoza everything is eternal. For starters, adequate understanding of things is understanding them, is conceiving them sub specie aeternitatis, and we know that adequacy entails truth, so truth that is correspondence with the object, so this seems to entail that everything is, in fact, eternal. Another way to derive this conclusion is that there is an equivalence between necessity and eternity. Spinoza often says that necessity entails eternity and eternity entails necessity, which would mean that Spinoza's necessitarianism, his idea that everything is necessary in nature, implies that everything is eternal. So these are two ways to come to this conclusion, but maybe more interestingly, Spinoza also often states that duration is abstract, or that it pertains to inadequate conception. In the TEI, he says, Spinoza explains that the intellect only attends to duration, it only perceives things under duration when it imagines. The same idea can be found in the Ethics, where he says that knowledge of duration, of ourselves and of external things, is necessarily inadequate, so imaginary. And the same conclusion follows from proposition 21 in the fifth part, which states that the mind only imagines when it endures. But as we will discuss more extensively later on, the mind, so the idea of the body, only endures when its object endures. In sum, the mind only imagines when it represents a durational object. So all of this seems to indicate that duration pertains to the imagination. And this is explicitly confirmed in a scholium to proposition 45 of the second part, where Spinoza says that duration amounts to an abstract way of conceiving. He writes there, by existence, here I do not understand duration, i.e. existence insofar as it is conceived abstractly and as a certain species of quantity. So again, the conclusion seems to be duration pertains to abstract conception. So is Hegel right then? Well, not so fast, because in many, many passages, Spinoza writes about duration as if it's a real thing. So how can we reconcile this with all these citations? My question today is, can duration be both abstract and real? And I think it can. But to understand how this is possible, we first have to understand how Spinoza understands abstractness, what abstractness means for Spinoza, what it means when he says that duration is abstract. So, in his early work, Spinoza follows the traditional nominalist terminology and characterizes abstract ideas as beings of reasons, ensia rationis. And we can find this term all throughout the short treatise and the Cogitata Metaphysica. However, this term only appears once in the Ethics, and not in the systematic part of his geometric demonstration, but in an appendix, the first appendix. And the underlying reason for this shift is most probably that Spinoza came to realize that his doctrine of parallelism and his doctrine of the unity of mind and body, that these doctrines forbid something to exist solely in the mind without correspondence in things. They forbid something to be an ens rationis. If the mind and the body are one and the same thing expressed in two ways, nothing can ever be an ens rationis existing solely in the mind. Therefore, in the Ethics, the notion of being of reason is replaced by the notion of inadequate ideas. And inadequate ideas are not fabrications or fabulations of the mind. Instead, they are understood in terms of mutilation. This is the notion that he uses again and again. They are understood as mutilated ideas. But what does it mean to say that abstract or inadequate ideas are mutilated? Well, inadequate ideas are ideas of the imagination. So they are images. And images are representations of imprints in our body left by other bodies. Now, since these imprints are cut off or abstracted from their external cause, they are, as Spinoza says, they are like conclusions without premises. In other words, these ideas of the imagination are incomplete. And this incompleteness, or this abstraction from what is needed, or abstraction from the cause, this abstraction, this incompleteness, it becomes even worse when these images become confused with each other. So, given the limited character of my body as a printing surface, and given the fact that imprints are buried in new imprints, images emerge in which, as Spinoza says, the slight differences between the singular have disappeared. So, for example, all the imprints that individual dogs leave in my body, they are covered on each other, they are buried in each other, and they become a very confused, confused bodily image or bodily imprint. And the idea of this bodily imprint is then the idea of a universal dog. However, this image is, of course, highly abstract, highly incomplete, as it does not have a definite size or a definite color or a definite shape. It lacks a great number of details, and it is thus a highly incomplete or a highly mutilated idea of a dog. So, before we go further, note that I make no real distinction between abstractness and inadequacy. I believe that both amount to partiality or incompleteness. Now, of course, what we normally call abstract ideas or universals are a kind of second-order images. So these are images meshed together from first-order images. So they are even more mutilated, further removed from the thing than the first order of images. However, I take this to be a mere difference in degree that is not really relevant for what I will say on the status of duration. So in a certain sense, all inadequate ideas are abstract, that is, mutilated, incomplete, which is, I believe, the meaning that Spinoza gives to the notion of abstraction. And it thus fully coincides with inadequacy. Now, the falsity of ideas also consists of this mutilation. As Spinoza writes, ideas are not, for Spinoza, ideas are not false. Ideas are not false because they contain something that does not exist outside. So their falsity does not consist of fabulation. Instead, it consists of deprivation. So ideas are false because of what they lack and not because of what they contain. As he says, falsity consists in the privation of knowledge which inadequate or mutilated and confused ideas involve. Spinoza explains this in the following passage. I should like you to note that the imaginations of the mind, considered in themselves, contain no error, or that the mind does not err from the fact that it imagines, but only insofar as it is considered to lack an idea that excludes the existence of those things that it imagines to be present to it. For if the mind, while imagined non-existent things as present to it, at the same time knew that those things did not exist, it would, of course, attribute this power of imagining to a virtue of its nature and not to a vice. And then an example is given of this in a later passage, and the example is originally Descartes, and we have already encountered it. The image of the sun as a small yellow disk 200 feet away from us in the sky, it does not positively contain error. It is only false because it lacks, or when it lacks, knowledge of, as Spinoza says, the true distance and the cause of this imagining. So when this image of the sun as a small yellow disk, when it is supplemented with other ideas of the sun that are lacking from it, then we have an adequate idea of the sun. So correction does not happen by elimination of false ideas, but by addition of ideas by which our knowledge of something is completed. And the deeper reason why falsity of ideas cannot be something positive, but merely amounts to incompleteness, is that Spinoza's doctrine that God's infinite intellect contains all ideas. And this is central idea to the second part, the third proposition of the second part. God's intellect contains all ideas. But of course, as Spinoza writes, all ideas, insofar as they are in God, agree entirely with their object, i.e. they are true, they are adequate. So the question then is, how can false, how can inadequate ideas exist in God's intellect, if all ideas must be in God's intellect? Well, Spinoza's conception of inadequacy as mutilation, as incompleteness, this allows him to say that false or inadequate ideas exist in God's infinite intellect as incomplete parts of true adequate ideas. And this is then the corollarium that I have already referred to, corollarium to proposition 11 from the second part. He writes there, from this it follows that the human mind is a part of the infinite intellect of God. Therefore, when we say that the human mind perceives this or that, we are saying nothing but that God, not insofar as he's infinite, but insofar as he is explained through the nature of the human mind, or insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human mind, has this or that idea. And when we say that God has this or that idea, not only insofar as he constitutes the nature of the human mind, but insofar as he also has the idea of another thing together with the human mind, then we say that the human mind perceives the thing only partially, ex parte, or sive, inadequately. So ex parte partially is inadequately. It's the same thing. So let's visualize this. Inadequate ideas are partial ideas. That is, they are ideas which are incomplete in our mind. These ideas exist in God's intellect, as all ideas do, but these ideas, these inadequate ideas, are completed in God's intellect by other ideas so that they together form an adequate idea. So the image of the sun as a small yellow disk is an incomplete, partial, and inadequate idea when it is cut off, when it is abstracted from the idea of its real distance and the idea of the causes of this image. So when I have this image of the sun, but I do not have those other ideas of the sun, then I have an inadequate idea of the sun. But in God's intellect, this image of the sun as a small yellow disk is completed and thereby corrected by those other ideas of the sun. In some, and this is crucial, inadequate and abstract ideas are not illusions or chimera. Their ontological status is not non-existence or existence limited to the mind. Instead, inadequate and abstract ideas are nothing but incomplete things, incomplete parts of adequate ideas. Therefore, they are real, but incomplete, partial. Now, some authors have argued that since ideas can only exist in God's adequate intellect, that this would then entail that inadequate ideas, and more broadly passive affects, that they do not exist. For example, Harold Joachim, in his well-known Hegelian reading of Spinoza, argues that individual minds with their passive affects, that they vanish in the infinite intellect, because they are there completed and turned into adequate ideas. So in the end, there are no inadequate ideas according to this reading, and De La Rocca has more recently defended a very similar interpretation. However, I believe that these interpretations, they overlook the mereological meaning of the relation between inadequate ideas and God's intellect. Spinoza clearly and repeatedly says that the human mind, just as any idea, is part of God's infinite intellect. So, and in the correspondence with Oldenburg, Spinoza clarifies what he means by this. Similar as in the Ethics, Spinoza there writes in letter 30, "Men are only a part of nature. Hence, we perceive things in part, in a mutilated way." But in the next letter, letter 32, Spinoza explains this in part, this mereology. He explains it more fully. And this letter, and the famous example of the worm in the blood, this example has been often read to examine, to understand the mereology of physical bodies. And this is certainly true, but the letter and the example of the worm are also meant to explain how, as he says in the letter, how the human mind is part of a certain infinite intellect. So therefore, the status of the blood particles in the blood and the blood in the wider cosmos, it does not only illustrate how physical bodies are part of the cosmos, it also illustrates the status of ideas in God's intellect. So let's take a look at this example and what it can say about the status of inadequate ideas in the infinite intellect. So the parthood of the blood particles is explained in terms of them being affected by external causes. They are parts insofar as they are, as he says, surrounded by others and determined by one another to exist and produce effects. So in other words, a blood particle is the inadequate, the partial cause of itself. It needs others to be what it is. But it does not vanish in the whole cosmos. It exists in the whole cosmos. The cosmos does not eradicate the existence of the blood particle, instead it completes it. But the particle, as a passive, partial being, really exists in the cosmos. And I believe that ultimately Spinoza's mereological model amounts to a form of organicism, which takes an organicism as the idea that the organism is the main model to understand nature rather than a machine. So an organ, like the liver, is something that is a part of a whole, the human body, and by extension the whole cosmos. And what does this mean? It means that a liver, it cannot be what it is, it cannot be a liver, without the rest of the body. It is itself a partial existence. That is, it is an inadequate cause of itself. It needs others, it needs the heart, the stomach, the blood, to be what it is. But it is not any less real for that. The liver exists in the body, but as an incomplete part. And likewise, this is my argument, likewise, inadequate partial ideas exist in the infinite intellect. The infinite intellect does not dissolve these ideas, instead it completes them. Now, as we have seen, the falsity of an inadequate idea is not something positive. Therefore, as Spinoza says, when we correct, for example, our inadequate idea of the sun as a small yellow disk by learning about its true distance and the causes of this image, when we correct this idea, we keep the original idea, and we merely supplement it with other ideas. Therefore, God's complete idea of the sun, his adequate idea of the sun, still contains the image of the sun as a small yellow disk 200 feet away from us in the sky. So, and this is crucial, inadequate ideas do not vanish by being completed by other ideas. Instead, and this is my main point, inadequate ideas enjoy a very peculiar ontological status. They are real but incomplete. And I will now try to show that duration also has this peculiar ontological status, the status of incompleteness. So, I will try to derive from this the ontological status of duration. I argue that the answer to the question how inadequate ideas exist in God's intellect, it matches the answer to the question how duration exists in God's eternal existence. In other words, these puzzles match up. And although this might seem far-fetched, I think that the link between these puzzles, it becomes clear when we introduce a more specific version of this puzzle on duration, namely the puzzle regarding the ontological status of durational ideas. So we first have to establish that the puzzle on how inadequate ideas exist in the adequate intellect matches the puzzle on how durational ideas exist in God's eternal intellect. If we have done this, I think it's easy to see that the answer to the question regarding the ontological status of durational ideas can be extrapolated and also answers the question regarding the status of duration in general. So let's take a look at this puzzle on how durational ideas exist in God's eternal intellect. Spinoza argues in the fifth part in Scholium to Proposition 40, he writes, "Our mind is an eternal mode of thinking, which is determined by another eternal mode of thinking, and this again by another, and so on to infinity, so that together they all constitute God's eternal infinite intellect." And this follows from a couple of other passages, which I will not cite. So, in conclusion, the infinite intellect consists of eternal ideas. This seems to be perfectly logical. The eternal infinite intellect consists of eternal ideas. But, of course, the infinite intellect contains all ideas. And there are also durational ideas. So then the question is, the durational ideas must somehow also exist in the infinite intellect, since the latter contains all ideas. But how can durational ideas be contained in God's eternal infinite intellect? This infinite intellect, which, as Spinoza says, is constituted by eternal modes of thinking, somehow also contains durational modes of thinking. But this puzzle, this riddle, it actually matches the riddle that we have already discussed, namely the puzzle on how inadequate ideas exist in the adequate intellect. Why? Well, this is simply, why do they match up? This is simply because durational ideas are inadequate ideas, and vice versa. As Spinoza says, durational ideas, that is, ideas which, as he says, involve existence through which they are said to have duration. They are ideas of singular things, insofar as they are said to have duration. So durational ideas are things of durational, are ideas of durational things. However, knowledge of duration, that is the idea of a durational thing, is necessarily inadequate, he says in Propositions 30 and 31 of the second part. In other words, the idea of a durational body is necessarily an idea of the imagination, an inadequate idea. As Spinoza says, the mind can neither imagine anything nor recollect past things except while the body endures. Therefore, durational ideas, which are ideas of durational objects, are necessarily inadequate ideas. Durational ideas are inadequate ideas, and inadequate ideas are durational ideas, because the mind can only imagine when, and so forth. So inadequate ideas. But of course, we have already seen how Spinoza solves the puzzle on how inadequate ideas exist in the infinite intellect. So and now we know that this is also answers the question how durational ideas exist in the infinite intellect. So inadequate ideas, which we have now come to identify as durational ideas, are incomplete parts of God's eternal and infinite intellect. So durational ideas, like inadequate ideas, are real but incomplete. Now, a possible objection to my strategy of explaining the ontological status of duration through the ontological status of inadequacy, a possible objection to this is that it's not justified, because the fact that durational ideas are always inadequate and vice versa, it does not necessarily prove that duration and inadequacy are sufficiently related in such a way that they share the same ontological status. And to answer this objection, I will try to show that the reason why an idea is durational is the very same reason why it is inadequate. And this becomes evident when we bring in a third notion, namely passivity. I will start with the relation between passivity and inadequacy. The equivalence between inadequacy and passivity, it is clear from how the explanation of passivity, how the explanation of inadequacy in the corollarium to Proposition 11, second part, so the passage that we have already discussed earlier, where Spinoza says that inadequate ideas are partial, this explanation is perfectly mirrored in the explanation of passivity in the second proposition, third part. Spinoza there says, we are acted on insofar as we are a part of nature, which cannot be conceived through itself without the others. We say that we are acted on when something arises in us of which we are only the partial cause, i.e., something that cannot be deduced from the laws of our nature alone. Therefore, we are acted on insofar as we are part of nature, which cannot be conceived through itself without the others. In other words, when we are passive, when we are the inadequate cause of what arises in us, so we are passive insofar as we are the inadequate cause of what arises in us. So inadequacy, it not only applies to ideas, it not only applies to knowledge, it also applies to being. Knowing inadequately, that is partially or passively, corresponds to being inadequately, that is partially or passive. Knowing inadequately, that is having ideas that are only adequately known by God, insofar as God knows this idea, not only through my mind, but also through other ideas. This corresponds to being inadequate, that is, having states and affections of which your nature is only a partial explanation, for which we need other things to explain what arises in me. But we also find this relation between passivity and inadequacy, we find a very similar relation between duration and passivity. The fact that durational ideas are necessarily inadequate also means that they are necessarily passive. In other words, the active-passive distinction, it maps on the eternal durational distinction. And let me start by showing the link between activity and eternity. So this is the opposite of duration and passivity. The link between eternity and activity, insofar as we are active, that is, according to Spinoza, this means that insofar as our nature explains what arises in us, insofar we know adequately. That is, our ideas can be completely conceived through our mind. But insofar as our mind knows adequately, that is, insofar as it is active, it is eternal, Spinoza says. He writes, the mind, insofar as it is eternal, is the adequate or formal cause of the third kind of knowledge. So eternity and activity seem to be imply each other. And conversely, duration seems to coincide with passivity. As Spinoza says, duration is existence which does not follow from the definition or the essence of the thing. It is thus existence in which we are dependent on others. It is existence of which the thing itself is the insufficient cause, that is the inadequate cause. So likewise, another way to derive this is, as we have seen, insofar as our mind is durational, it has a durational object. That is, it is the idea of a durational body. And insofar as it has an enduring object, the mind imagines. That is, it knows inadequately and thus passively. So here too, duration entails passivity. So, and I hope this isn't getting too complicated, the link between the puzzle regarding the ontological status of inadequate ideas and the puzzle regarding the status of duration and durational ideas, this link can be made, in an even more stronger sense, through the fourth question regarding the ontological status of passivity. All these puzzles match up. This is what I argue. So this puzzle regarding passivity is, how can passivity exist in God who is fully active? And Spinoza's answer, similar to the other puzzles, is passivity amounts to being partial. My liver, for example, my liver is passive because it is the incomplete cause of its existence. It is itself not a sufficient explanation of its existence. Therefore, it is an incomplete existence that is completed by the other organs and the blood, and by extension, everything else in the cosmos. So my liver only exists because this inadequate causation of itself is completed by other causes. Nevertheless, my liver really does exist in God. Likewise, my claim is durational existence really does exist in God, but it exists as a partial part of its complete and thereby eternal existence. So, I think we can thereby explain how Spinoza, on the one hand, writes that duration is abstract, and he holds that everything is eternal. And on the other hand, he speaks about duration as if it's a real thing. Duration is real, just as inadequate ideas are real and passivity is real. However, all these things, duration, inadequacy, passivity, they all exist partially in nature. That is, they are incomplete, but their complete existence is eternal, adequate, and active. But they do not vanish, again, they do not vanish by being completed. They remain in God as an incomplete part. Just as the image of the sun as a small yellow disk, it remains in God's adequate intellect and his adequate idea of the sun, his complete idea of the sun. Okay, now, finally, there is still one issue to solve. I've argued that durational existence is an incomplete part of eternal existence, just like inadequate ideas are incomplete parts of adequate ideas. But it is not clear how the parthood relation can explain the status of inadequate and durational existence, because both inadequate, or as I would say, durational ideas, and adequate or eternal ideas, they are both part of the infinite intellect. So in short, there seems to be an excess of parthood relations. Inadequate ideas are part of the inadequate ideas are part of adequate ideas, inadequate ideas are part of the infinite intellect, and adequate ideas are part of the infinite intellect. So it is not clear which parthood relation is supposed to explain the ontological status of duration. And how can parthood explain inadequacy or duration if adequate and eternal ideas are also part of the eternal infinite intellect? Well, to be clear, it is not parthood that explains inadequacy or durational existence. Ideas are not inadequate or durational because they are part of the infinite intellect. No, what makes ideas inadequate is that they are partial parts, incomplete parts, that need other parts to be complete. So the idea of the sun as a small yellow disk is an inadequate idea because it is in itself an incomplete idea of the sun that is supplemented in God's intellect by other ideas. The complete idea of the sun, however, is also a part of God's infinite intellect, but it is a complete part. My mind understands adequately insofar as my ideas are complete and do not require other ideas, that is, insofar as it is active. As such, my mind is the adequate, complete cause of my ideas. However, my mind is thereby still part of the infinite intellect, of course, but it is an adequate, active, and thereby eternal part because it is a complete part. So there is this distinction between partial parts and complete parts. And it can be traced back to Spinoza's definition of parthood in the letter 32. The definition goes as follows. He says, I consider things as parts of some whole to the extent that the nature of the one adapts itself to that of the other, so that they agree with one another as far as possible. So, at first sight, this seems to mean that parts are necessarily influenced by each other, and thereby they are necessarily inadequate. They are necessarily the inadequate causes of their own states, because their states are also produced by other things. So it thereby seems that parts are always passive, always inadequate. But this is not necessarily the case. This mutual adaptation, it can also constitute a form of activity and adequacy. Humans, for example, are more active when they relate themselves to other humans with a similar nature. And this is what Spinoza explains in the appendix to part 4 of the Ethics. And this is something that I got from Sophie Laverin's book. He writes there, it is impossible for man not to be a part of nature and not to follow the common order of nature. But if we live among such individuals as agree with this nature, his power of acting will thereby be aided and encouraged. On the other hand, if he is among such as do not agree at all with his nature, he will hardly be able to accommodate himself to them without greatly changing himself. So, when parts agree in nature, this mutual adaptation, this coherence, which is essential to being a part, but when parts agree in nature, this mutual adaptation, it becomes a mutual affirmation, which increases their activity. So parts can thus be adequate causes of their own states while still being parts, while still being influenced by one another, but influenced in such a way that they affirm one another. So in that sense, parts can be complete. And I believe this explains how both durational and inadequate ideas and eternal or adequate ideas are part of the infinite intellect. So to summarize, a durational idea is a partial part of the eternal infinite intellect. This means that it is an inadequate idea that is only adequately taught by God in combination with other ideas. Therefore, it is a passive idea that is dependent on others. But by contrast, an eternal idea is a complete part of the eternal infinite intellect. This means that it is an adequate idea, and it is thereby active. That is, it is the adequate cause of its ideas. In short, it is incompleteness rather than parthood that explains both inadequacy and durational existence. And I will end there. Thank you.